Welcome, everyone, to Swedenborg Room, a video podcast from Our Daily Bread, spiritualquesters.org. We're with the Swedenborgian Church of North America. My name is the Reverend Thom Muller, and I'm here with the wonderful Rudy.
Yes.
And we're just getting started on this video podcast series. Basically, just chatting about all things Swedenborg. You may be aware there's a good amount of resources on the internet these days, which is awesome, on Swedenborg and by Swedenborgians. And we figured it'd be nice to have to contribute to that in a way that kind of represents some of the thought and approach that is kind of predominant or present in the General Convention, which was one of several Swedenborgian denominations that there are. So that's kind of what we'll be chatting about, and we figured we would kind of start with who Swedenborg was. I don't know if Rudy has any leading intro questions about that.
Well, I mean, if I didn't, then I'd be dead weight. So let me introduce myself a little bit first. Hey, everyone. I'm Rudy Caseres, and I am the Digital Communications Manager for the Swedenborgian Church of North America. Been working there for, over 2 years now. And there's still a lot that I don't know. And so this is going to be a great way for me to learn all the ins and outs, the down and dirty and the nitty gritty, because I have quite the teacher to sit under the learning tree. So I feel very privileged to do this. Thank you for putting up with me. And I look forward to, as the weeks progress, to really get into this and hopefully reach a more broad audience. Because I represent all of you out there who just are curious, but just don't know where to start, don't know the right questions to ask. So I'm sure along this ride, I will sound completely silly with some of the questions I ask for some of you hardcore Swedenborg enthusiasts out there. But that's why we're here. So let's get down to business. And what better place to start than talk about the man himself and what he stood for? So take it away, Thom. Where do we begin?
Well, it might be nice to kind of give a quick... We'll go into stuff like what is the Swedenborgian Church, et cetera, et cetera. In future episodes, we figured it'd be good to kind of just start with who Swedenborg is, right? You may or may not have been exposed in depth to the old Swede. So just a kind of little elevator speech about who Swedenborg was. Swedenborg was a scientist turned mystic. He was born in Sweden. Surprise, surprise, based on the name. He was born in Sweden in 1688 and lived most of his professional life as a natural scientist. He was born into a fairly well-to-do family, which ended up actually being ennobled, and made his life mostly all about natural sciences. His dad had been a Lutheran bishop, in fact, and was somewhat disappointed with Swedenborg's secular path, but that's kind of how it ended up for him. He ended up being a pretty renowned natural scientist in quite well known throughout Europe at the time. And back in that time, Swedenborg is a great example of what we might now call a Renaissance man, although of course he didn't literally live in the Renaissance, of someone who was extremely well versed in just plethora of disciplines, from mineralogy to biology to philosophy. Interestingly, he never had a huge interest in theology for most of his career, which before his spiritual awakening was already really prolific. And it wasn't until the 1740s that he started having a major mystical awakening, where, one way of putting it, he became frustrated with the limits of natural science, of the natural science of his day, and underwent a kind of spiritual awakening, which to him it manifested as he claims as being able to view spiritual realms, enter into different spiritual states, receive knowledge about such things as the nature of God, the inner esoteric sense of Scripture, etc., etc. Swedenborg never founded a religion or church. He really, in some ways, is a beautiful example of someone who is trying to reconcile rationality and mysticism or spirituality, and I think did so very beautifully. Swedenborgianism is really something that developed after Swedenborg, initially as book groups back in England, and as things go, ended up developing into what now are several Swedenborgian church denominations. But I think it's always important to bear in mind when we talk about Swedenborgians that the vast majority of what I would call Swedenborgians have nothing to do with any of the Swedenborgian churches, but are simply folks that are reading Swedenborg and are gaining spiritual insight from it. So that's kind of an inherent paradox we're always dealing with, but important to bear in mind that we are not talking about an organization or a denomination or a religion in that sense, but to really bear in mind that Swedenborg did not have that intention. And one of the beautiful parts about Swedenborg and Swedenborgianism is a very pluralistic view of spirituality. So I'll kind of leave it at that and see if there's any questions came up.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I've always wanted to know is you talked about Swedenborg having these mystical experiences where he's basically going into the other world to a higher plane. And a modern skeptic might say, that's not possible. Like, what is going on there? Is this a metaphor? Is this like just Swedenborg is just like on a on a different plane than the rest of us? Is he crazy? How do you reconcile that? Because most people, I would reckon, don't have these same similar experiences. So what made Swedenborg so different?
Yeah, those questions that you pose are super relevant, and they're something that Swedenborgians have wrestled with for a very long time. And there's really no simple answer to that. Especially in our particular flavor of Swedenborgianism, there's a huge emphasis on personal discernment in terms of what do we often call them the writings mean, what is their nature, etc., etc. And you will find that Swedenborgians fall all over the spectrum in terms of how they view the writings of Swedenborg. All the way from this is a third testament, this is a new revelation, to Swedenborg literally talked to spirits, angels, etc., that were literally folks that have passed on, and his descriptions of, say, the afterlife are literal metaphysical descriptions, all the way to folks that would completely psychologize what he's seeing, saying, well, this is merely a mystical experiences that he is having that illustrate spiritual principles. I'm not going to lie, I personally kind of fall in the middle, as I think many Swedenborgians do, and we'll get a little bit more into where that idea comes from. But something that's really essential for Swedenborg is the concept of layers and the concept of, we'll talk about it later, correspondences. So the notion that a lot of things, especially when it comes to religious texts, have a huge variety of meanings, many layers of meaning, with the inner or esoteric generally being considered the higher. So we have our kind of ego-driven mind that is very much obsessed with time and space and the literal, which is valid. But there is also the notion that really any time you are talking about a visual or a space-based manifestation of an idea that we see in religious writings, that we see in scripture, there is a deeper layer to it, a deeper meaning that neither denies nor depends on its literal accuracy. And we'll go plenty into that as we talk about correspondences and emanations and layers of reality. But basically, the answer to your question is people fall all over the place and people fluctuate on where they stand on this. And I think it's healthy to have that kind of dynamic of simply allowing the individual to take what they want and leave what they don't in terms of what makes sense for them in their own spiritual journey.
Now, before I ask my next question, take a pause. Make sure not to tap on your desk or the microphone. It's picking up on the microphone. Okay. So why didn't Swedenborg just say outright, here's what I really meant, make no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I don't want to be misinterpreted. Why this confusion? Why these multiple interpretations?
Yeah. Well, we're going right into it in a sense that layeredness of reality that Swedenborg talks about. There is a concept in Swedenborg's writings called correspondences. Some people consider correspondences to be primarily symbols or allegories, and a huge amount of, well, really all of Swedenborg's biblical exegesis, meaning his approach to sacred scripture, his basic claim is that scripture is a way to illustrate spiritual principles. Those spiritual principles may be illustrated by stories that are literally true in time and space. Regardless of that latter aspect, he would claim that they are true on a spiritual level in the sense that they reflect something that is not bound by time and space. He also acknowledges that when he is having spiritual experiences, what he is seeing is manifestations through images and other senses of spiritual principles. So that's where kind of this nuance comes in, where, for example, well, we can use Swedenborg's take on, say, scripture as an example. When we look at, for example, the 7 days of creation, most people are somewhat familiar with what that's talking about, the biblical account or accounts of creation. Swedenborg looked at that as a purely symbolic correspondential story, right? So he would say what this is talking about is not the literal creation of the physical universe, but the spiritual creation that unfolds within us. So we go through the 7 days, 7 stages, et cetera, et cetera. This is not something that's unique to Swedenborg, by the way. This is something we see within the Western esoteric tradition, that we see among mystics of various tradition. The notion that there is a deeper, more personal, more intimate, direct layer of meaning and significance to these stories. And a lot of what Swedenborg writes about is what he felt was the inner sense of some of these stories. Now, an example of a different dynamic would be Swedenborg's view of some of the gospel accounts. Swedenborg, for example, believed that Jesus Christ actually existed. And, for example, he believed that Jesus Christ literally resurrected from the dead. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but Swedenborg is really proposing that in the latter case with the Gospels, this literally happened for the most part, and it is an allegory, or rather a correspondence, a symbol for our own journey and for inner spiritual principles. So he talks about, for example, the life of Christ corresponding directly to what he calls our own regeneration, our own spiritual journey. So you see a little bit of where that layeredness comes from, right? That notion that you have stories and images and themes that are representative of spiritual states and realities. But that layer of meaning does not depend on necessarily whether those things are literally or metaphysically accurate. So when we look at Swedenborg, there's that age-old question that Swedenborgians have been asking from the very beginning on with those book groups in England, which is, well, if Swedenborg says that scripture is correspondential, for lack of a better term, we'll use the word allegorical or symbolic, if that's what he says scripture is all about, the inner meaning, why would we read Swedenborg then and his writings in a purely literal fashion, right? So there's that one of the age-old debates there is how do we then read Swedenborg? And that again is something that each individual is encouraged to discern on their own terms. And like I said, I've seen people all across the spectrum in terms of how they read this stuff and really gaining a lot of spiritual insight and spiritual inspiration on wherever they're at in their journey. So I think one of the things that is not completely unique but very precious about Swedenborg is his huge emphasis on free agency, of the matter of freedom and consent in terms of spiritual growth, and the notion that it really is something we discern personally and very much in opposition to what was kind of the prevalent theology of his time and heavily Lutheran Sweden. Swedenborg did not believe that beliefs get you there. He did not believe in salvation by faith alone, which again was a very prominent, very prevalent idea at his time in the Protestant world, which he was immersed in, but believed that the spiritual life is a life of usefulness, of lived love and truth-seeking, regardless of the specifics of one's beliefs. So he was a qualified universalist. He believed that all religious traditions can be vessels for our spiritual growth, regardless of whether or not we believe or buy into specific metaphysical ideas.
Now, you said that Swedenborg, he didn't intend to start his own denomination or religious movement, which leads me to believe he didn't see himself as a prophet. And usually with prophets, we take everything that they say as the Holy Gospel. But what are some teachings, what are some writings by Swedenborg that are more controversial, that are just, I wouldn't say universally, but really like majority of people are like, that seems kind of suspicious?
Sure. I mean, it really depends on who you ask, of course. And once again, the question of, well, actually, you phrased the question really well, which is how did Swedenborg view himself, right? We talked a little bit about how Swedenborgians view Swedenborg and his writing as opposed to what Swedenborg himself believed. He usually did not refer to himself as a prophet in that sense. And again, I'm simply talking about Swedenborg viewing himself. This is not something that is proscriptive for Swedenborgians. I believe that Swedenborg himself did see himself as a revelator who was on a mission, on a commission, so to speak, from the divine to reveal spiritual truths which he claimed were, in fact, accurate. So I think that's something important to remember when we kind of try to discern where we stand and how we read Swedenborg, is that to Swedenborg, yes, he was, I think, quite humble, although there is also a narcissistic side to him. But I think he was quite humble and really, truly did see and believe the things he saw and believed. And he did see himself as, in some sense, authoritative. Again, you have to remember that Swedenborg did not believe that correct beliefs, including Swedenborgian beliefs, are in and of themselves salvific or necessary for someone to achieve spiritual growth. But a theme that is really important, perhaps even central in Swedenborg, which you are kind of alluding to with the question of what is unique about Swedenborg, is that Swedenborg believed that we were now in a New Age, something he calls the New Church, which is not an organization. He has a weird way of using the word ecclesia or church to mean ages or aeons. So he talks about different ages that the world has gone through from the earliest people as churches, although there, of course, were not churches in the sense of like a denomination, but stages in human development. To him, the church is primarily something that is within us, that is inside, that is not a denomination or an organization or even a religion. But he claimed that we have entered, this of course would have been, in his case, he believed that this was something that happened spiritually in the 1770s, where he believed we were entering a new age of spiritual enlightenment, of spiritual growth, collectively and individually, where we would all have our eyes, or the potential to have our eyes open to the spiritual world in ways that were profound and new and advanced and advancing. So in some ways, he, by the way, equates this correspondentially with the second coming of Christ, which he did not believe was a literal event, but a spiritual event that we all undergo. And he claimed that he did undergo that experience and shared his experience of it. But it's really important to remember that one of the ways I put it is, if Swedenborg was truly right, we are now further in the new church than he ever was. So there's that essential element of Swedenborgianism, which is progressive. And I don't mean that to say politically, people fall all over the place, right? I'm going to use the term progressive. I mean, it is a tradition that looks towards the future as a place of increased growth and potential, rather than looking back to the past. So there's this notion that the new church, the new age, is something that is constantly evolving as we evolve spiritually. And there's grand stuff to come. So that, I think, is an important element to bear in mind when we talk about how we read Swedenborg, is that while he did see himself as genuine and authoritative in what he's experiencing, he also believed that people in the future would have an enormous increase of spiritual insight that one could argue would, his own insight might even pale in comparison.
Now that leads me to my last big question is, how would Swedenborg see the world today? Would he see it as like his vision coming true, or would he be like, this is not what I imagined when I first started putting my works out?
Well, another classic question people have debated about. I think Swedenborg would have mixed views of what our life and what our society is like. Swedenborg was very much an Enlightenment philosopher who believed in, again, I'm not saying this necessarily with a political connotation, but liberal ideas such as spiritual freedom, interfaith harmony, these ideals, equality, et cetera, that certainly within many parts of the world have manifested. And it's kind of ironic that when we look at the 1770s and, of course, the creation of the United States, et cetera, new ideas of democracy, a lot of the things that I think we in our culture, at least theoretically, value are these Enlightenment era values, which have to some degree been realized. There's a psychologist named Steven Pinker who coined the term progressophobia, which is a term that he claims applies to social, philosophical, political groups all over the place and across the spectrum. But it is a societal and an individual tendency that we sometimes have in our culture to deny progress, to deny the fact that there have been major advances in the sight of the many difficulties that we still face. So it's a very mixed bag, I would say, and it's, again, something we all may have our unique perspective on. But I think he would be optimistic. He was always optimistic. I think he would call out ways in which our society is still unjust and bigoted, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But once again, the Swedenborgian worldview is essentially a positive worldview when it comes to the future, which I think is something nice to hold on to and to aspire to, but something that is very complex. And the way that Swedenborg views human spiritual evolution is it's not simply this very, very clear upward curve, but it's something that fluctuates. He would argue that essentially we're heading in the right direction, but he very much acknowledges that that takes a lot of growth. It takes a lot of, in some cases, it takes steps back, and we look at human history and very much see that. We see terrible events, for example, that then have the result of uniting people, et cetera, right? So it's not this kind of simplistic, everything's getting better every single year, but once you zoom out at the human family and at creation, there is this notion that he has that ultimately we are moving towards union with God. We are moving towards closer connection with each other. And in fact, he believed that that was a big topic in and of itself. The purpose of life and the purpose of creation was a union. This is what he writes in Divine Love and Wisdom 170. That the purpose of creation is an eternal union of the created universe with its creator. And that we are moving closer and closer to a spiritual state in which we are more able to reach our spiritual potential together and individually.
Now, just to be clear, this is one of those other questions that may sound silly to the more seasoned Swedenborgian. When we talk about the new church, does that mean that, it's a completely new world? It's like the rapture, and it's like this whole 1,000-year reign and all that stuff that are in other Christian denominations. Did Swedenborg think that this new world would have happened by now in the year 2025?
Right. This is another excellent question because it asks the question of, once again, time and space, et cetera, et cetera. I think one way of understanding what the new church is that it is primarily an inner state that we cultivate as we grow in union with the divine and lead a more altruistic, useful life. It is something that is already here, he claimed, and available to all of us. I think a sentiment that I think a lot of people in our contemporary society can relate to is the idea that heaven is now, which is very central, again, to Swedenborg, is that, yeah, sure, there's these ideas about afterlife metaphysics, but what really matters is the current moment and tapping into spiritual states and spiritual realities that are available to us right now. And he claimed that the new church, the second coming, all of these terms that he uses for this new aeon, this new age, are already there and are primarily something that is inwards. I believe it's in Heaven and Hell that he writes that the Lord's church is universal and exists among all people who live lovingly and acknowledge the divine. So there's really this notion that the church, as I mentioned before, is not an organization. The church is a spiritual state, an individual spiritual state that exists internally. He says the church is within. It is not outside anyone. The church is an inner state that we cultivate, as well as a collective state that we can inhabit, but it is independent from such things as organizations or particular dogmas.
Yeah, see, that's the thing that all these so-called prophets had predicted the end of the world or the second coming. All you had to do was just say, it's already here.
Yeah, and it is, honestly, you mentioned controversial ideas from people coming from a both a more traditional sort of Judeo-Christian background or people that come from a secular background, that statement carries a lot of, for some people, perhaps a weird taste. The notion of the second coming, because again, we've been, I think, conditioned within Western Christianity to kind of view these things not only as literal, but perhaps even as threatening. And to Swedenborg, that's really not the case. The just like everything in Scripture and in religious narratives, this is an inner process that's happening, something that is unfolding within us now. And people who have a bit of a background in, say, the mystical traditions, will find that's not, again, not an uncommon position to take. But it's kind of hard to swallow for some people who come at it from a bit more of a literalistic point of view. So we're back to that central Swedenborgian theme again of inner and outer, and how he claimed that inner reality is not only more real and more important than outer reality when it comes to such things as metaphysics and religious literature, but it is also not dependent on the literal. That makes any sense.
Yes, and we are just scratching the surface. That this is about as basic as we're going to get. I mean, we're going to get really deep in the weeds going forward. So handlebars are off, or handlebars. Gloves are off. Training wheels
are off.
Training wheels are off. Okay, this is as easy as it gets. This is as I am only going to get exposed more and more for my ignorance going forward. But my hope is that within the next 10 years of us doing this podcast, that I will know as much as you do right now. That's my goal. So
nice. Excellent.
That's going to do it. Let's do some shameless self-promotion. Obviously, this is going up on the ODB YouTube page. I don't know where else we would be, but just talk a little bit more about what we have to look forward to, where we can find you elsewhere, so on and so forth. Do your thing.
Sure, yeah. So as we've mentioned, we are affiliated with a ministry of the Swedenborgian Church of North America called Our Daily Bread or spiritualquesters.org, which is kind of an information arm of the denomination. And I happen to be the senior editor of that. If you go to spiritualquesters.org, you'll see our website. We have Swedenborgian sermons, reflections, interviews, etc., etc. And that is kind of where we're coming from in terms of an organizational background. The best way to kind of find out about what we're doing here with ODB would simply be to go to spiritualquesters.org, check us out on social media as well, and we can go from there.
Yeah, and then, like I said, we're just scratching the surface, so I'm sure we'll get into all kinds of different subjects, such as the afterlife and other modern views and how it intersects with, mysticism, all that fun stuff. Like, you are the master, the teacher, and I am the student, and basically this podcast is the learning tree. And so I love to hear from all of you out there in YouTube land and beyond. If there's a topic you'd like to have us discuss, please leave it in the comments, or just want to give us feedback. We'd love to hear it. Go check out spiritualquesters.org. ODB. You got the Our Daily Bread on the Facebook page, Instagram. I am also, I guess, Swedenborgian Church of North America on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. I'm Rudy Caseres. Again, I am the digital communications manager for the Swedenborgian Church, but I'm just speaking for myself for this podcast. And that's going to do it for this week. Hopefully, you will have episode 2 out in the near future, and episode 3, and so on and so forth. I am in the middle of a move right now, as you can see with the mess behind me. So the next time you see me, I'll have a completely different background. So, and that's about it. Any other final words from you?
No,
Tom.
thanks, Rudy. This has been fun, and I'm just hoping we can kind of keep this going. It feels very much like a sort of a living room chat, which is kind of what we're going for. So, like you said, again, if there's anything you'd like for us to discuss and perspectives to bring in, we are all ears. There is really, honestly, nothing that is taboo in
Well, don't
terms
say
of.
that.
Well, yeah, I shouldn't say that. Okay. Our level of taboo tolerance is fairly high. Let's put it that way. So, really happy to talk about controversial issues or questions that may come up that maybe haven't been discussed in depth in other Swedenborgian spaces publicly. So, absolutely, bring it on. Bring us some questions or interests or comments or complaints.
Awesome. Okay, so that's going to do it for this episode. We will see you again on the other side for episode 2 and beyond. Can't wait for, if you're on episode 3000, to come back to episode 1 and being like, oh man, what happened? They used to look so young. So until then, until next time, take care and have a good day.